Hi everyone. So in this video we will talk about database integration. So we have already have database up and running, but how can we connect to the database? I mean, if we are not using NestJS, then it is easy. But we are using NestJS, and there is a NestJS TypeORM module provided by NestJS to connect to any database. Let's say MySQL. I mean, TypeORM is actually specific. And on TypeORM, you can use type as a Postgres, MySQL, or any relational database. And it provides integration in two different ways. One is a static initialization, where you just pass your credentials like username, password, database, host, and port. Another is a dynamic initialization, where you are going to get the credentials, this information, all the information from the config service, which is environment service, which will help you to fetch all the credentials at runtime. So here we are using TypeORM module.4root. There you just need to pass, okay, type is Postgres, host, port, username, password. Or the other thing is, if you are not fetching them directly from process.env, you have a NestJS config service, then how it works? It works a little different. I mean, there are many ways to register a provider. So here what we are doing is NestJS TypeORM module.4root. Inside imports, you are doing TypeORM module.4root async and passing the config module, and this config module will give us the runtime database URL or username, password, database, all these attributes at runtime through the config service. That's why we are using a dynamic initialization. Let's take a look onto these two together. Now let's see how we are initializing our database connection through these two different approaches. So we have our code. Here we are doing config module.4root, and here we can specify forroot. I mean, config module is overall global. Then you can write TypeORM module.4root and forroot async. These are two different variations we can use. These are two different ways we will talk about: TypeORM module.4root and forroot async. I mean, these are the two different ways in which you can integrate with your database connection. I mean, TypeORM module manages it, but TypeORM module need your connection URL, username, password, host, port, all those things. So you can either use TypeORM module.4root, pass all the argument, or you use TypeORM module.4root async, and then inject a config module config service, and using use factory method. I mean, this is just a way of registering a provider. Use factory, and we are passing config service, and then from config service it can get either you can have just a database URL or just all the parameters like host, port, username, password, all these arguments together. This is a simple configuration. Here we are doing TypeORM module.4root async and this config service. So here we are trying to get username, password, host, port, db username, db password. And this is how we can initialize. Now there is another way is you can also try a dynamic initialization of this module. And how this dynamic initialization, it is just a little bit different. How we deal with the static. In dynamic we will be using config service. So here we are going to create an external, independent NestJS module like db module, which takes care of everything about database. I mean, this is a good approach. You can have a Redis module, database module, where you write a database service, database module. You can have a Redis module where you create a Redis pub sub, Redis module, Redis service, right? It's better to create these reusable pieces, and here we are using db module.ts, right? So that's this is the database module, and inside database module we will be initializing TypeORM module.4root async. So here we are planning to just create a database module as a NestJS separate module, so that we can call just database module.4root, right? And you can say it's underneath. It is again using TypeORM module.4root async. So I just want to create a reusable database module so that you can use it in every project. So here I'm doing db module, and there is a static method forroot. It is returning this forroot async. You just pass config module config service, and you just need to write a use factory, right? So how this really looks like, get connection option. So here we are going to call another method, get connection option, that will give you the connection properties to initialize the database connection. So get connection options. Here we are doing config service and database config. Here if you see, the configuration is simple. It is returning an object with the type Postgres, database URL, SSL, entities, and synchronize false and logging false. Each and every line has their own specific meaning. The important thing is inside this TypeORM module, either you pass all these as a different argument like type, username, password, host, port, or if you don't like this, then you can just use a URL argument and pass the whole database URL there. So you don't need to have these explicit different variables, which is username, password, host, port, and all. So this is my database URL. I'm running a Postgres container. So my database URL is Postgres API development path localhost 5433 API database. And I'm passing this argument also SSL. If environment is local and test, then reject unauthorized false, otherwise false. So we are just passing a URL argument. I modified this method. Earlier we were thinking to pass all, but just combine everything inside a URL. URL contains your Postgres, username, password, host, port, almost everything. Okay, so that is what we are passing here inside dbconfig. Okay, so let's check the code. Okay, so this is my end-to-end build database module, which is a reusable and independent DB module. You can use the DB module .4root async or 4root, depends on, because this is user defined module, right? On top of that, you can define the static method, let's say 4root. So DB module .4root, and here you need to pass an object which contains entities. Okay, that's pretty much simple. This is how we initialize and integrate with the Postgres. And here you can say API database doesn't exist. That means I might not be passing the port correctly. So just fix the port 33 and just try to start the application and npm run start or run dev. And this time it has been connected to the application and application is running. So this is the overall summary, how you can do all these authentication things. So what we have covered? We have covered a TypeORM setup, right? TypeORM with the database. Now we will also talk about Redis. Redis can be a separate module where you can do all the Redis module, Redis service, and then the passport and express session related things. Hi everyone. So in this video, let's work on the Redis. So we have two things, TypeORM, Postgres and Redis. For Postgres, we have used TypeORM. For the Redis, also we are going to write a NestJS module and a service. So what we will do, Redis service.ts, and we will create a Redis module.ts. Okay, we'll write a code. Redis module, we will remove the existing code which uses the Redis client. So Redis module and Redis service. In Redis service, we are going to initialize the Redis connection, right? So inside the Redis module, it is simple. It is going to use a config module to get the Redis host and port. So Redis service will be a very simple setup. It will have a same injectable, and it will be just a simple ES6 class. It's like a same service as any other service which we have written. So inside this export class, Redis implements on module init, because in this Redis service, we also need to connect to the Redis client. We need to access the Redis client. So there are two different ways. Either you can write some code inside a constructor. So whenever the class gets initialized, it gives you the Redis client instance, or you can use on module init, which provides a method on module init. So using that also you can install this, and we are going to install the Redis module first of all. And inside this, we can just write async, just a method which can help us to connect to the Redis. So first of all, on module init, inside this function, we can write a code, helper code, which can help us to connect to the Redis. Or we can also write a constructor. So constructor will give us the config service, and inside this Redis URL we are going to get from the config service. That is important because it's a dynamic. We are going to get a Redis URL from the config service. This dot client equal to create client. Create client is already a part of Redis. Okay, guys, let's fix the typo here. Redis client type. Okay, we got the client instance, and then we can just check on client.onConnect. If there is an error while connecting to the client, we can just log that or await this client.connect. I mean, you can also write this code inside a constructor, but I want to avoid it. On module init is actually a specific way to initialize the service, and this is actually lifecycle method which can help us to, I mean, you want to bootstrap something before instantiating the object of the class, you can do it on module init. And then there is a last method we have is get client. So at runtime we can also call get client method of this class, this dot client. So we can get this Redis client instance from directly here. Now we need to change the Redis URL. I mean, Redis URL will have a Redis localhost 6379, and we will just introduce a Redis module. If you are trying to add a HTTP or something, obviously it won't work, right? When you do npm run start, it will break. So what you need to do, you need to fix that Redis URL. So here you can see unknown protocol. Yeah. So you need to just change the environment variable to Redis and npm run start. We have added a Redis module in the app module already. You can see domain module and Redis module. So now we can check if we are able to connect to the Redis or not. We are already able to connect to the database, right? So we will just do the check with same check with the Redis. We are able to connect. That is the two things. Second thing we have done, right? Connecting to the database and connecting to the Redis. So this is like our basic foundation setup is done. Now we can start writing the controllers, middlewares, guards, auth service and auth module or user module for that. Okay, so now in this video, let's try to understand the NestJS helper modules to implement authentication, right? So NestJS, I mean, you might have heard about Passport with the Express Node.js, right? So NestJS provides its integration. I mean, it is providing its own module like NestJS Passport, NestJS CWT, which provide a lot of different strategies like local strategy, which helps with the when you are doing authentication with the username password. And that's what we are doing. We are doing a simple session based authentication demo with the NestJS TypeORM Passport Redis, where we are going to allow user to enter the username password. Session created, now use the same session to access any protected routes. So how NestJS can help us? NestJS already has this passport module which provides us all these things. So NestJS Passport provides passport strategies. You need to install all these modules, passport local or NestJS Passport. And implementing the passport strategies are simple. Here we created a user service, which is just a mock. And this is our auth service, which is just validating the user from the mock data. So you create a auth service, and this is here local strategy. So Passport provide these different strategies. This strategy works just for username password. You enter username password and it will validate for you. Now we also need to understand the actual flow, how all these things are connected. So we have a user module, auth module, and the passport, an express session, right? So we will write a authentication route in the auth module, auth controller. We will write a user sign up inside a user module, user controller, and this passport strategy, passport, auth guard, or serializer will be part of the authentication module. So here you can see we are adding a passport module as a dependency, and then you can write these controllers like simple auth controller for login. If you are able to successfully log in through the local strategy, you can just access the user from the request object. So here we are setting auth guard local. It will be using a local strategy, which is taking username password. So this is the flow which I am talking here. So client will send a login request with the email and a password. It will directly go to the local strategy because we are using passport. Local strategy will validate. It has a validate user method. It takes a username and password. I mean, email is again a username. Don't get confused here. In the passport, by default, it takes username and a password as a 2 argument for the login. So it's username password. Local strategy again using auth service to validate. Auth service, it will validate everything is good, user is exist, user password is valid. This auth service will return a user, and that user will go to the passport. Passport will initialize, passport will serialize that user and set that user inside a session. Okay, and if you are using the Redis to persist the session, then serialized user will overall we are using express session, and that session will be stored inside a Redis. So this is overall the flow, or you can see all these building blocks, how they are connected. So let's now try to plug and play. So what all things we need here is, so we are going to create a user entity, because we need somehow to store some mechanism to store the user attributes, I mean the sign up mechanism. So here in this section, let's talk about user module, user entity, user controller, user service, which will allow us to onboard a user in the database, where user can log in with the user can sign up with the email and a password. Okay, so this is a simple user service we are writing, which is just using TypeORM. Here we are not talking about how TypeORM works, but injectable export class user service. Inside constructor, you inject the repository, private user repository, and then just write a helper methods like find by email, create user, update user, delete user, find by ID. So because you can also find using find one by email, find one by ID, or create. Create will help us to create a user in database, that user repository.save. And so this is a simple user service we have. Now next thing we are going to do is user module and a user controller. So this is our simple controller, user controller users, export class user controller. Inside this user controller, we will inject the user service, and we will define all the routes like sign up. Sign up is create user. Create user will pass a username and password or email password. So we need to define the DTO. I mean, when you want to pass a body, it's better to create a DTO. So create user DTO we can define inside user.dto.ts, which has 3 arguments: email, password, or role. Okay. First of all, for this we need to add a class validator. Now what is the role of class validator? Class validator helps us to validate the request body. So here install the class validator, so that we will say, okay, email should be of type email, password should be of some constraint you can add, role should not be empty. So just add the class validator, and then you should be able to import the class validator like all these things. Update the entity. Inside entity, now we will have all these attributes, which are like email, password, or role. So that's our user entity. Inside user entity, now we have ID. ID can be of auto-generated or UUID. That depends on how you define email, password, and role. And so we have just entity and create user DTO. We'll rename it to the user controller.ts, and then we'll also define. So just import the DTO here, and just write a simple code, which is nothing but creating a user by hashing the password. So await this user service.find. Let's find the user with existing email. If it doesn't exist, then that's good. If it already exists, conflict exception. Otherwise, create the hash version of the password. Now also here, if you are using bcrypt has some complication because it's a native library with the C and C++. So always use bcrypt.js. Also I face the same thing. It's better to just change the bcrypt to the bcrypt.js. So first we are creating the hash version of the password, and then we are just doing user service.create. We already have a create method. Just pass the existing payload, override the password, and the role. By default you can set the role equal to user. Okay, password is a hash password, and once the user is created, return it successfully. And now our simple user module, which contains, okay, inside a user module, just put a TypeORM module.for feature, user service, user controller, and exports user service. A simple user service we have created. Let's add this user module inside our main module, domain module. So another thing is, you also need to pass the entity database module.for root and pass this user entity, so that, because we have set the database module synchronized true. What is this synchronized, false or true? Synchronized false means do not refresh the database on change of the entities. But for development local, we can just set it to true. What it will do is, when you start the application, it will check, okay, you have created entity. Based on that, it will apply the change in the database. All the mod changing, like truncating the columns, renaming the columns, changing the constraint. So this is what it does. You should not use this in the production, because this is not safe, because it directly apply the change in your database by looking at the entities. You should use migrations for that. So here we'll just do npm run start, and it will update the database. It will just create the tables and all the sort of operations it will perform. some error with the bcrypt. Okay, I need to fix it. Just replace this bcrypt native library to bcrypt.js. Bcrypt.js also provides the same thing, and we will just start the application again. And here we have entity, module, service, and controller. I mean, in the domain module, we have registered it. The synchronize is true. So let's start the application again. So these are like let's say if I want to use a new column address, what will happen when you restart the application or start the application? It will alter the database table based on what you are adding inside entity. Logging also we need to make true so that we can also see the logs which are happening in the TypeORM. Otherwise you won't see the TypeORM logs, whatever the query it is running to update the database table. Let's say I'm just adding some random columns just to show you the logs which are being generated through TypeORM. So you can see here, and the last line, alter table user, add user column username. If you see the last line, so this is running these queries. So this is called, you don't need migrations, you are just syncing the database directly. So this is all we have. We have actually created entities and user controller, user sign up. So we can just now use APIs to create user in our database.